They found his teeth before they found his name, scattered across the cobblestones like loose dice after a bad hand. The rain made the blood shimmer under the flickering streetlight. Dominic Kane, 38, ex-soldier turned speakeasy enforcer, stepped out from the alley, his boots splashing through shallow crimson puddles. The air reeked of copper and whiskey, and the night carried a silence so heavy it pressed against his ribs. "It's starting," Dominic muttered, his voice low, his eyes locked on the faint glow from the speakeasy's back door. Inside, laughter and jazz masked the tension that had been building for weeks. Sophia Marino, 26, daughter of Don Marino, adjusted her fur coat, her fingers trembling though her smile held steady. She whispered, "My father doesn't forgive, Dom." Outside, the rain grew heavier, each drop hitting like a ticking clock, counting down to something violent. Somewhere beyond the door, betrayal was already breathing. Dominic straightened his tie, feeling the weight of his revolver beneath his coat. He knew this night would end in either silence or gunfire. There was never anything in between. Inside the speakeasy, smoke hung thick over the crowd, curling around dim bulbs strung above chipped tables. The scent of gin and sweat mixed with the brass heat of the trumpet. Dominic moved through the haze, his eyes scanning every corner. At the far end, Don Marino, a man whose presence could choke the air from a room, leaned back in a booth, flanked by two silent men in dark suits. "You're late," he said, his tone more verdict than greeting. Sophia slid into the booth beside her father, keeping her gaze low. "The streets are different tonight," she murmured. Dominic stood at the edge of the table, feeling the weight of every glance in the room. The Don's eyes narrowed, studying him like prey. Somewhere in the music, a single note bent sharp, and the bandleader's hand twitched. Dominic felt the shift, the unspoken signal that trouble was already here. The band slowed to a sultry crawl, the notes heavy enough to sink into the worn wood floors. Dominic caught sight of Mickey Doyle, a rat in a silk tie, slipping through the side door. Mickey's grin was too wide, his steps too quick. "We got company," Dominic muttered under his breath. Sophia stiffened, her hand curling into a fist beneath the table. Don Marino didn't turn his head, but his voice cut like a blade. "I told you never to bring the police here." Across the room, Mickey leaned toward a man in a gray overcoat, words spilling fast. Dominic's stomach turned. Gray overcoat meant law. And law in here meant blood before morning. I. Dominic moved through the crowd like a shadow, weaving between tables, his coat brushing against polished chairs. The gray coat turned toward the exit, and Mickey vanished behind him. Sophia's eyes followed Dominic, her lips parting as if to call out, but no sound came. The Don's hand gripped her wrist, keeping her still. "Let him handle it," he said. Dominic's palm rested on the revolver, thumb brushing the worn grip. Outside, the sound of rain grew sharper, closer, as if waiting for the first stream. The alley outside was colder, darker than before, the rain now a steady curtain. Dominic stepped into it, eyes locking on Mickey at the far end. The gray coat was gone. Mickey lit a cigarette with shaking hands, his grin slipping. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice trembling under the hiss of the rain. Dominic didn't stop walking. "Neither should you." In the distance, a car engine coughed to life, headlights flaring. Somewhere inside that light was the reason the night had started with teeth on the ground. The headlights carved the rain into hard lines as Mickey backed against the brick, his cigarette dying in a hiss. Dominic said, "Tell me why the street started eating teeth tonight." Mickey's laugh cracked like a wet match. "Because the money's gone," he said, eyes flicking past Dominic toward the idling Packard. Sophia stepped from the doorway, rain jeweling her cloche, her voice steady but low. Sophia said, "Whose hands touched it last?" Mickey's grin drained. "Mine, then the gray coat, then nobody." Dominic felt the alley tilt, the city's heartbeat slipping off rhythm. Dominic said, "The culp has a name." Mickey swallowed. "Detective Henry Vale, and he hates the Don more than sin." A siren moaned somewhere, too far to save anyone who mattered. The Packard's engine coughed twice, as if deciding whether to run or witness. Dominic said, "You're walking me inside and you're telling the truth where he can hear it." Nicky nodded, but his hands kept shaking like the rain. They slipped back into the speakeasy, and the music died like a throat cut, leaving the band stranded in silence. Don Marino did not rise, but the room lowered itself to his eyes. Don Marino said, "If there is a cop in my books, I will salt the harbor with him." Nicky's voice tried to climb out of his mouth and fell back in. Nicky said, "Detective Henry Vale took the cash and promised a truce." The Don's knuckles tapped the table in a patient rhythm that felt like shovels. Sophia said, "A truce means a war already started." Dominic watched the door, counting breaths between creaks. Dominic said, "Vale wants leverage, not money." The Don's smile arrived without warmth. Don Marino said, "Then he wants a body I will not give." A glass cracked beneath someone's boot, and the bandleader flinched. Dominic said, "We find Vale before he turns my name into evidence." The room inhaled, and the smoke looked like ghosts practicing exits. The plan grew teeth over the table, fast and mean. Dominic said, "Vale meets his informants at the Fulton Fish Pier before dawn." Sophia's hand found a pencil and mapped a tide of arrows on a napkin. Sophia said, "He'll park facing the river because cowards like exits." Don Marino's eyes drifted to the door and back, weighing ghosts. Don Marino said, "You bring me Vale breathing, or bring me his badge with seawater on it." Nicky tried to look smaller than his bones. Nicky said, "I can make the call and bait him." Dominic nodded, but felt the hook snag his own mouth. Dominic said, "You call, I follow, we close the trap." Outside the rain softened, but the quiet felt less kind. Sophia said, "I'm coming to keep you honest." The Don almost smiled, cruel and paternal. Don Marino said, "If he touches you, I'll drain the Atlantic." The phone booth in the back hummed like a nervous insect, while Nicky dialed with damp fingers. Dominic stood outside the glass, counting the clicks, tracking the fear. Nicky said, "Pier 3, half hour, same price, no eyes." He listened, then swallowed, then nodded to the silence that answered. Sophia watched the hallway mirror and saw 3 versions of herself, each more tired than the last. Sophia said, "He's coming, but not alone." Dominic felt it in his ribs, a drum roll that never ended. Dominic said, "We'll make a loan for him." Don Marino stepped from the booth's shadow and left a roll of money on the sill like bait. Don Marino said, "You catch a cop with the same patience you catch a saint." The band restarted, softer, as if practicing at a funeral. The rain eased into a whisper that sounded like someone rehearsing last words. They reached the pier before the sun remembered its job, the river a black lung pulling slow breaths. Crates stacked like sermons lined the slick planks. Dominic said, "No hero moves, only clean ones." Sophia's breath plumed and vanished, a rehearsal for loss. Sophia said, "I will speak. He will underestimate me, you will finish it." Nicky hovered near the edge, smelling like regret and cheap smoke. Nicky said, "He comes in a gray Plymouth with one headlight dim." A gull laughed at them from the fog. The city behind them looked like a confession booth with the door open. Dominic said, "When I raise my hand, you go left." The horn of a barge moaned, long and final. Footsteps approached, paced like a metronome set to danger. Dominic said, "Detective Vale owes the house, and the house always collects." Fog rolled off the river like a tired god, and the gray Plymouth slid into it with one eye dim. Dominic said, "Detective Vale, you took money that didn't ask to leave." The door opened slow, as if the night had to grant permission. Detective Henry Vale, 42, lean and starved looking, lifted his coat collar and smiled without heat. Vale said, "I took proof that your Don keeps saints on a payroll." Sophia stepped forward, chin up, breath like silk smoke in the cold. Sophia said, "If you have proof, show it before the tide drowns your courage." Nicky hovered, a moth deciding which flame to die in. Nicky said, Pier 3 is bad ground for sermons. The foghorn moaned as if counting their sins. Vale held up a leather ledger, edges swollen with damp. Vale said, names, shipments, prices, and one signature that belongs to you. Dominic felt the river press against his ribs, like a second heart. Dominic said, you forged it, or someone wants me buried under it. Vale flipped the ledger, and the pages whispered like gossip that killed for fun. Vale said, the signature sits in ink, like a confession that learned manners. Dominic took a step, and the boards complained with old bones. Dominic said, you got that from my hand, or from a liar who wears my shadow. Sophia watched the corners of the fog where secrets collect interest. Sophia said, who benefits if Dominic burns? Mickey edged closer, fingers trembling for a cigarette he had already smoked. Mickey said, we do the trade and walk. Vale's mouth made a thin door through which truth refused to enter. Vale said, I trade nothing, I collect debts. A gull scraped the air, and the river clapped once against the pilings. Dominic said, then your debt is to me. The ledger lowered, and behind Vale 2 silhouettes formed like promises that never intended to keep. The night pulled tighter, and even the fog seemed to brace. The first shot cracked from the fog like a coin tossed by a cheap god, and a crate beside Mickey burst into wet splinters. Sophia said, down, and dragged him behind a stack smelling of brine and old knives. Dominic moved before thought could argue, revolver out, eyes cutting lanes through mist and light. Dominic said, show your hands or lose them. Vale didn't flinch, which meant he had already placed everyone on a chessboard drawn in blood. Vale said, you brought the Don's daughter, so now the Don will come. Another shot rang, closer, angrier, and a pier lamp popped, throwing shards that caught in the fog like stars with bad timing. Mickey said, I didn't set this, but guilt rode his voice like a passenger that refused to pay. Sophia breathed slow, her courage a knife she turned inward to sharpen. Sophia said, find the flank, end the noise. The river leaned in, eager for anything that floated. Silence fell the way blood dries, slow and certain, and then the silhouettes stepped closer with their guns lifted like opinions. Dominic slid to the right, and found the angle that liars forget to guard. Dominic said, now, and the night obliged with a gust that cleared a ribbon of fog. He fired once, and a man folded like a prayer that lost faith. Vale didn't twitch, he smiled as if the move belonged to him. Vale, said, every path you take, ends at the same door. Sophia rose and cut left, her heels refusing to slip where her childhood had learned balance. Sophia said, not if the door was never ours. Mickey crawled toward the Plymouth, shame pulling at his spine like a leash. Mickey said, I can block them. A third gun appeared from the far end, and its owner wore a hat tilted with familiar arrogance. Dominic's gut turned to dust. Dominic said, that's merino steel. The hat lifted, and the face under it belonged to Enzo Marino, 34, Don Marino's nephew. A grin cut to fit only betrayal. Enzo said, Uncle sends his regards and his regrets in equal measure. Sophia swallowed the hurt and straightened, queening on a board that burned at the edges. Sophia said, you don't speak for blood while selling it by the ounce. Dominic felt the ledger's accusation tilting toward a verdict that wore his name. Dominic said, you forged the signature and fed Vale the bait. Vale let the fog finish his smile. Vale said, I don't cook lies, I simply serve them warm. Enzo aimed at Dominic's chest and winked like a streetlight about to fail. Enzo said, you were always the Don's favorite weapon, so he dulled you first. The gulls finally shut up as if the sky did not dare argue. Dominic said, then he will see what a broken blade can do. The river took that promise and kept it. The fog thinned just enough for Dominic to see Enzo's finger tense on the trigger. A pier plank groaned under the weight of betrayal. Dominic said, if you kill me, you break your uncle's last shield. Enzo smirked, eyes gleaming like coins in a gambler's fist. Enzo said, the old man's kingdom is already mortgaged. Sophia's breath caught, the air around her heavier than truth. Sophia said, You'd sell your bloodline to a cop? Vale tilted his head, ledger under one arm like a priest with scripture. Vale, said bloodlines end when the ledger says they do. A distant bell tolled from the harbor, cold and final. Dominic stepped forward, ignoring the barrel aimed at his chest. Dominic said, then you'll need more ink for my ending. The fog curled between them, unwilling to pick a side, and the river whispered promises only the dead believed. The first punch came from the side fast and close, breaking Enzo's aim. Dominic drove his shoulder into him, sending the gun skidding into the mist. Enzo said, still the Don's dog. Dominic's fist answered harder than words. Vale moved in, but Sophia stepped between, her coat flaring like a drawn curtain. Sophia said, you'll shoot through me before you touch him. The fog swallowed the sound of their breaths, turning it into something ghostly. Enzo spat blood, teeth clicking against the wood. Enzo said, you think this ends with me? Dominic kept him pinned, eyes scanning for the silhouettes Vale kept in his pocket. The gulls circled, waiting for the pier to finish its work. Vale's hand hovered at his coat, not for a gun but for the ledger. Vale said the truth is heavier than bullets. Dominic said, then you're about to drown in it. Enzo twisted, kicking Dominic off, both men sliding on wet boards. The gun clattered near the pier's edge, one wrong touch from the river's mouth. Sophia's eyes darted to it, then to Vale, who stood unnervingly still. Sophia said, you want the Don, you'll have to pass me first. Vale smiled faintly, stepping back into the fog's embrace. Vale said, I already have him where I want him, watch. From the mist came the heavy footfalls of more men, each one carrying the weight of Merino loyalty, warped into something uglier. Enzo rolled to his knees, wiping blood with the back of his hand. Enzo said, now you see the future, cousin. Dominic rose, gunless but not unarmed, his fists curling with the precision of memory. Dominic said, if this is the future, I'll tear the page out. The new arrivals fanned out, their footsteps clicking like typewriter keys writing someone else's ending. Dominic's gaze locked on the nearest man's knife, the blade catching what little light the fog allowed. Sophia stepped back toward Dominic, her coat brushing his arm. Sophia said, we can't win this standing still. Enzo laughed low, a sound shaped like a lock clicking shut. Enzo said, you're not supposed to win. Vale adjusted his ledger under his arm, watching like an investor waiting on a risky bet. Vale, said Merino, blood spilling on the pier, makes everyone richer but the dead. Dominic lunged, knocking one man into the water, the splash swallowed instantly by the dark river. Dominic said, that's one debt paid. The others moved in, their shadows merging until the pier seemed to be shrinking. The fight broke into fragments, grunts, splinters, and the wet smack of fists meeting skin. Dominic ducked under a blade, came up with a hook that rattled teeth. Sophia tore the pistol from the boards, firing once into the air, the sound splitting the fog like a crack in glass. Enzo froze just long enough for Dominic to send him sprawling into stacked crates. Enzo said, you think this saves you? Sophia's eyes burned brighter than the muzzle flash. Sophia said, it saves me from being you. Vale retreated 2 steps, ledger still dry despite the chaos. Vale said, every storm runs out of rain. Dominic stood over Enzo, chest heaving, knuckles bloodied. Dominic said, then let's see if this one can flood first. The pier held its breath, the river leaning in to listen. The pier lay broken in more ways than wood, and the fog now tasted of gunpowder and iron. Dominic dragged Enzo to his feet, gripped like a noose. Dominic said, we finish this inside, where the Don can hear his own blood lie. Enzo's laugh was hoarse, almost joyful. Enzo said, he already knows. Sophia stood near the edge, pistol low but ready, her eyes flicking toward Vale, who lingered like the last page of a bad book. Sophia said, you've been feeding him this whole time. Vale tipped his hat, ledger balanced in his hand. Vale said, some debts you collect early. Dominic shoved Enzo toward the Plymouth, its single working headlight glaring through the fog like a judge that didn't care. The gulls followed, sensing something still had to die before morning. Dominic said, "Then let's not make them wait." The Plymouth's engine coughed awake, carrying them from the pier's ghost light into the city's darker veins. Rain traced maps across the windshield, each drop a road to ruin. Dominic said, "Where's the dawn?" Vale in the passenger seat didn't answer, flipping the ledger's pages with slow contempt. Vale said, "Closer than you want, farther than you think." Enzo sat between Dominic and Sophia in the back, wrists bound but voice free. Enzo said, "He sent me to burn you, Dom, because he can't kill you clean." Sophia kept her eyes on the street ahead, the glow of street lamps sliding over her cheek like bars in a cell. Sophia said, "Then we burn him first." The city blurred by, wet neon smearing into colors that didn't exist in daylight. They stopped outside the back entrance of the Speakeasy, where brick walls leaned like tired men. Dominic cut the engine, letting the silence settle like a sentence. Dominic said, "Inside now." Vale stepped out first, holding the ledger close as if the rain might steal it. Enzo followed, smirk still stitched to his face. Sophia's heels clicked on wet stone, each step echoing in the narrow alley. Sophia said, "If he's inside, we don't leave without ending this." Dominic's eyes scanned the windows above, but no light moved, just shadows that refused to blink. The air was thick with whiskey fumes bleeding from the door cracks, and the city seemed to lean in to hear. The door opened to the low hum of a room not yet awake, but ready to kill. Don Marino sat in the corner booth, a silhouette wrapped in smoke. Don Marino said, "My daughter brings me a traitor and my soldier brings me a cop. Tight." Sophia's jaw tightened, the words tasting of iron. Sophia said, "Your nephew forged the signature, your cop sold it." Dominic dropped the ledger onto the table. It landed with the sound of a coffin lid closing. Dominic said, "Decide if you want to die with the truth or live with the lie." The Don's eyes shifted between Enzo and Vale, then to Sophia, his gaze softening like a shadow at dusk. Don Marino said, "You've brought me a storm." Dominic said, "And you're standing in the floodplain." The Don leaned forward, hands clasped, the rings catching what little light dared approach. Don Marino said, "Enzo bleeds family but never loyalty. Vale bleeds nothing, which is why I trust him less." Enzo spat blood onto the floor, grinning through the red. Enzo said, "Better a traitor than a corpse waiting for permission." Vale's voice was silk dragged over a blade. Vale said, "This ledger doesn't care who dies, only who signs." Sophia stepped forward, her voice steady as stone. Sophia said, "Then sign your own damn name, father." Dominic's gaze locked on the Don, waiting for the flicker of decision. The Don smiled faintly, a man who already knew the ending but enjoyed the telling. Don Marino said, "Then let's write it." The Don's smile vanished as if erased by a hand the room couldn't see. Don Marino said, "Enzo, you've wasted the family's time for the last time." Enzo leaned forward, blood drying on his split lip. Enzo said, "Then kill me yourself, uncle." Dominic stood ready, every muscle coiled like a spring that knew its own breaking point. Dominic said, "Or let me." Vale placed the ledger on the table, like an offering at a crooked altar. Vale said, "Whoever walks out of this room owns everything inside it." Sophia stepped between them, eyes sharp enough to cut the smoke. Sophia said, "And whoever walks out without me has nothing." The silence that followed was thicker than the walls, the air ripe with the weight of old debts finally due. The Don's fingers tapped the table once, twice, deciding. The Don rose, his shadow spilling across the table like spilled ink. Don Marino said, "This family has no room for weak hands." Enzo smirked through the pain. Enzo said, "Then why are yours shaking?" Dominic's jaw tightened, eyes locked on the Don's every movement. Val's gaze never left the ledger, as if its weight anchored the whole night. Sophia turned to Dominic, voice steady. Sophia said, "He's not shaking from fear, he's shaking from rage." The Don's hand slipped inside his jacket, slow enough to feel like a countdown. Dominic said, "We're out of time." The walls seemed to lean inward, every patron in the speakeasy frozen in their seats, watching history load its gun. The gun appeared in the Don's hand like a secret everyone had been expecting. Dominic's revolver was already up, the two barrels staring across the table like mirrors. Vale stayed still, the ledger untouched, his eyes tracking every twitch. Enzo chuckled low. Enzo said, "Looks like we both lose tonight." Sophia stepped in front of Dominic, her back to his chest, voice cutting through the hum of fear. Sophia said, "If you shoot, you kill what you came here to protect." The Don's eyes flickered, not with doubt, but with calculation. Dominic's voice was low, dangerous. Dominic said, "One of us leaves this table with your crown, and it isn't you." The first shot shattered a glass instead of a man, whiskey spilling across the table like blood that couldn't decide where to fall. The Don's aim shifted, but Dominic was already moving, catching his wrist. The struggle cracked the table's edge, wood splinters biting skin. Sophia grabbed Enzo's arm, forcing him away from the chaos. Vale's hand hovered over the ledger, then pressed it flat as if to claim it. Dominic twisted the Don's gun, clattering to the floor. The room erupted into gasps and the scrape of chairs, but no one dared step in. Dominic said, "It's over." The Don's eyes said otherwise. The Don stood, chest heaving, but the fight had already drained from his bones. Don Marino said, "If you take my seat, you take my enemies." Dominic holstered his revolver, voice steady as stone. Dominic said, "I'll take them and their ghosts." Sophia released Enzo, who stumbled back, no longer smiling. Vale lifted the ledger, offering it to Dominic like a contract signed in shadows. "Vale," said, "every empire needs its bookkeeper." Dominic didn't take it. Dominic said, "Every empire needs a conscience first." The Don's gaze softened, pride and defeat tangled in the same breath. Don Marino said, "Then maybe you'll do better than I did." Don found the speakeasy pale and emptied of applause, a stage set for verdicts. Dominic said, "This ends before the city wakes." The Don sat heavy, crown invisible, sins visible. Don Marino said, "You think a ledger can bury a dynasty?" Vale stood with priestly patience, eyes colder than the barrel he didn't draw. Vale said, "I'm not burying you, I'm appraising you." Enzo laughed softly and tasted blood again. Enzo said, "Sell him the roof and keep the floor." Sophia stepped closer to her father, shoulders squared and trembling anyway. Sophia said, "This family forgets to forgive." Dominic felt the night lifting, but not the weight. Dominic said, "Pick a door, Don, and live with it." The Don's gaze met Sophia's and found a memory that used to be mercy. Don Marino said, "I pick the door you will carry." Silence took the room and began writing names. The Don reached for the ledger as if it were a relic that might absolve him. Vale did not resist. The book wanted a different confession. Vale said, "Read the last page." Dominic watched Sophia, not the paper. Dominic said, "What did you trade for my life?" Sophia's breath stuttered and found its courage. Sophia said, "I called Vale before the pier so he'd take you alive." Enzo spat a laugh that sounded like a nail. Enzo said, "She made the call." The Don turned the final sheet and found his own signature copied in his neatest gilt. Don Marino said, "You used my hand to close me." The room tilted, even the bottles leaned. Dominic said, "You weren't after money, Vale." Vale smiled like a lock turning. Vale said, "I was after him." Funeral black filled the club as men arrived like shadows, auditioning for hell. Dominic wore the same suit he killed the Don's dynasty in, and it fit like penance. Dominic said, "If you want me, take a number and a priest." Vale stood near the bar, badge hidden, hunger not. Vale said, "You will carry the crown as evidence." Sophia's voice lowered and sharpened. Sophia said, "He carries me or nothing." Enzo drifted among the mourners, with a gunman's patience. Enzo said, "Bloodline wants a bloodline." The band played one quiet note and let it die. Don Marino rose with a dignity that burned. Don Marino said, "I forgive the sins that serve the family." Dominic felt the bullet coming the way sailors feel storms. Dominic said, "Then forgive this." The room exploded into thunder. The first shot hit a mirror and multiplied the dead. Dominic moved on instinct, pulling Sophia down, returning fire that taught the room new prayers. Dominic said, "Stay with me." Vale advanced through smoke like a tide that taxed every breath. "Vale," said, "drop it and sign." Don Marino stepped between them, old lion choosing his last hunt. Don Marino said, "You don't audit my house." Enzo chose chaos and fired at the dawn, eyes bright with inheritance. Sophia rose and fired back, grief turning perfect and straight. Sophia said, "No more ledgers." Enzo fell, grin finally out of business. Vale flinched, and that was enough time for Dominic to close the distance. Dominic said, "The book stops here." The ledger hit the floor and learned silence. The room settled into a hush that remembered thunder. Don Marino bled and sat, eyes bright with a mercy he had not worn in decades. Don Marino said, "I wrote the first debt, pay the last." He sagged and gave the club back to the living. Sophia held his hand as it cooled. Sophia said, "I won't let them rewrite you." Vale lay cuffed and furious, the badge now a cheap ornament on the floor. Vale said, "You'll be king for a minute and a ghost forever." Dominic stared at the ledger and thought of the teeth in the rain. Dominic said, "There's no retirement plan for ghosts." He closed the book and handed it to the fire. Flames licked the margins and devoured the alibus. Outside, the city breathed and did not apologize. Dominic said, "We open tomorrow under a different name."